Hey everyone, and welcome back to Coffeesodes. I'm Josh.
And I'm Kelly.
We're excited to be brewing up our 25th episode with you all.
Yeah. Today we're going to be diving deep into online sports betting, specifically how it's impacting household finances, especially for those who might be a little vulnerable.
Exactly. And we're going to be going over some pretty fascinating research on this, so be sure to check out the episode description for all the details.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, quick question for you. Have you ever placed a bet on a game?
Maybe you felt that thrill of a last-second win, or the agony of a close defeat.
Or maybe you've dabbled in fantasy football, spending hours crafting that perfect lineup.
Well, get ready for some eye-opening insights. Whether you're a seasoned bettor or just curious about this whole trend.
We're going to go beyond the hype and those headlines to really try and understand the financial implications of all this.
All right, so to set the stage, let's rewind back to 2018. Remember when the Supreme Court overturned that federal ban on sports betting?
Oh, yeah, that was a game changer. It really was. Basically opened the floodgates for all these online betting platforms to pop up. I mean, we went from a handful of states allowing sports betting to now having 25 states, plus D.C., where you can legally place bets online.
The numbers are crazy. We're talking billions of dollars being wagered every single month. And it's not just about Vegas anymore. Online sports betting has really become a mainstream form of entertainment.
Oh, totally has. But here's a question. Who's actually placing all these bets? Is it like a totally new crowd? Or are we seeing existing gamblers just kind of jumping on this new bandwagon?
Well, the research seems to suggest that it's more often than not folks who are already familiar with the gambling world. So, those who might already be playing the lottery or enjoying a hand of poker online.
Right. Adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. And here's another interesting little tidbit. Nearly 70% of all online sports betting transactions are happening on just two platforms, FanDuel and DraftKings.
They've really become like synonymous with the whole industry. It's incredible how dominant they are. But, that kind of market concentration also makes you wonder about the risks involved. What if something goes wrong or people are getting in over their heads?
Right. And that's where this research gets really interesting. It starts to try and connect the dots between this huge surge in online betting and what's happening with people's investments and overall financial well-being.
Okay, so let's talk investments for a second. This research points to a trend that's definitely worth paying attention to. As online sports betting is going up, something else seems to be going down. Investments.
Exactly. And we're specifically seeing this reduction in net investments, particularly those going into after-tax brokerage accounts. The ones that many people use for their long-term savings.
Now, for those who might not be familiar with that term, after-tax brokerage account, think of it like a regular investment account where you're putting money in after you've paid taxes on it. It's a common way for folks to invest in stocks and bonds and other assets to grow their wealth over time.
Right, exactly. And what this study found is that for every 10% increase in online sports betting activity, there's a corresponding 2% decrease in contributions to those accounts.
So it's like some people might be shifting their money from potentially growing their wealth to potentially losing it.
Yeah.
And to really try and dig into this, the researchers focused on households, where a large portion of their spending was classified as male-centric. So they define this as households were spending on things like electronics, sporting goods, and yes, gambling was higher than average.
And why did they focus on this group?
Well, because statistically speaking, men are more likely to engage in sports betting.
Makes sense. And what did they find?
What they found is actually pretty striking. This group, the ones with more male-centric spending, they saw a much steeper decline in investments, about 5%, after online sports betting became legal. So there's a pretty strong correlation there.
So we're seeing a potential link between this rise of sports betting and a dip in investments. And that link appears to be even stronger in households with more male-centric spending. I mean, it makes you wonder, are people truly weighing the risks and rewards here?
Right. And that kind of brings us to the heart of this whole deep dive. What happens when we look at all this through the lens of financial vulnerability? Are certain households more at risk than others? And what are the potential consequences?
Right. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to answer that, we need to understand what happens when online sports betting becomes legal in a state. Does betting activity just kind of creep up slowly? Or do we see more of like a dramatic shift?
Well, according to this study, it's more like the dam breaking. They found an almost immediate spike. in online sports betting deposits after legalization, adding up to an average increase of about $25 per quarter for households in those states.
Okay. And while $25 might not sound like a ton, keep in mind that's just the average across all households, including those who don't bet at all.
So for those who are betting, it's got to be much higher.
Oh yeah, for sure. For those who started betting after legalization, the average jump was closer to $180 per quarter.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah. So that's a pretty significant chunk of change, especially if you're already, living paycheck to paycheck.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. This upward trend in betting, it just keeps climbing as time goes on. Not just because more people are starting to bet, but also because those who are already betting are upping their ante.
Right. So it's not just about new bettors entering the market. It's also about existing bettors increasing their wagers.
And that sounds like a recipe for trouble, especially for those who might not have a lot of financial wiggle room.
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags. Now, it's important to say, this steady increase in betting could be driven by a lot of things. Could be effective marketing by the platforms, the growing social acceptance of it all, or even just the learning curve as people get more familiar with different types of bets and how these platforms work.
There's also the potential for addiction here.
Oh, absolutely.
For some people, those early wins, or even just the thrill of it all, can lead to chasing bigger wins, even if it means betting more than they can afford to lose.
Right. And that's why it's so important to talk about responsible betting practices and make sure that resources are available for folks who might be struggling.
Totally. Okay, so we've established that betting activity tends to increase a lot after legalization, both in terms of the number of people betting and the amount they're wagering. But what about the other side of the coin? What's happening with investments?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the research seems to show that there's like a substitution effect happening here. As online sports betting gains momentum, we see this relative decrease in net investments, specifically those flowing into after-tax brokerage accounts.
So it's not just that people have less money to invest because they're spending more on betting, it's that they're actively choosing to allocate those funds to betting instead of investments, which seems like a pretty risky move, especially when you consider the long-term benefits of investing.
Yeah, for sure. And they actually quantify this shift pretty clearly. They found a 14% reduction in investments going into those after-tax brokerage accounts, which translates to about $53 less per quarter being invested by households in states with legal online sports betting.
And I imagine for some households, it's probably way more.
Oh, absolutely. Now, one question that I had when I was reading this was, what about other forms of gambling? Like, does the rise of online sports betting lead people to cut back on things like playing the lottery or online poker?
It would make sense if they did.
Right.
People have a limited budget for gambling. So you'd think they might shift from one to another. What did they find?
Well, surprisingly, they didn't find a noticeable impact on lottery or online poker spending. It seems like online sports betting isn't necessarily displacing those other forms of gambling. It's more like people are adding this new form of gambling, what they're already doing.
Interesting. So it's not a zero-sum game. They're not just replacing one with another. They're adding to it.
Right.
It's a little concerning.
It definitely raises some questions. And, they actually did find a small but noticeable decline in deposits to cryptocurrency exchanges.
Oh, really? So it's possible that some people are pulling back from those riskier investments, like crypto, and redirecting those funds towards what they perceive as potentially more predictable bets on sporting events.
It's almost like there's this reshuffling of risk, where individuals are reallocating their funds from these high-risk, volatile investments to what they might see as more controlled bets on sporting outcomes. Which of course doesn't mean that sports betting is a safe or predictable investment by any means, but it suggests that people might be viewing it as an alternative to other forms of risk-taking.
Fascinating. It makes you wonder if there's like a psychological thing at play here, where people feel more comfortable with the familiarity and perceived control of sports betting, compared to the often unpredictable world of crypto or the stock market.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. Now I know what you're thinking. What about those gamified stock trading platforms, like Robinhood, that have made investing feel more like a game?
Right. Those have been criticized for making investing feel too much like gambling. So you'd think there'd be some overlap there.
And there is some. The research did find a decrease in net investments flowing into those types of platforms, which suggests that some people might be switching over. However, the overall decrease in investments across all platforms was much larger than the decline specifically in platforms like Robinhood.
So while there might be some folks shifting from those gamified investing platforms to online sports betting, the overall trend seems to point to a broader decline in investments across the board. It's not just about switching from one type of risky behavior to another. It seems to be impacting those investments. They're typically associated with long-term goals, like saving for retirement or a down payment on a house.
And that brings us to what's really important here. While some people might see online sports betting as a harmless form of entertainment, or even as a way to engage with the financial markets, the reality is it can have really serious implications for people's financial well-being, especially for those who are already struggling.
And in the next part of our discussion, we're going to delve deeper into how these trends are specifically impacting those households that are feeling the financial pinch, and what it means for their ability to build a secure financial future.
So we've seen how this rise of online sports betting can lead to a decline in investments. But how does this actually translate to, financial strain for people?
Yeah.
Especially for those who might already be on shaky ground financially.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, because we can talk about percentages and averages all day, but what does this actually look like in people's lives? Well, this research actually dug into this by looking at credit card balances and available credit. And what they found is a little concerning, especially for those households with low savings.
Yeah, it's not great. They found that in states where online sports betting became legal, households with low savings saw their credit card balances increase by an average of $368.
$368.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big jump. And it's not just a small group of people either. The study says this represents an 8% increase in credit card debt compared to the average for all households.
Yeah, it's a substantial increase, and it really suggests that these households might be turning to credit cards to cover their betting losses, or just to make ends meet when their budgets are stretched thin because of, increased betting.
And it's not just about taking on more debt. The study also found that these low savings households experienced a reduction in their available credit.
Right.
It's like a double whammy. You're already struggling to manage your finances, and now you've got less room to maneuver and more debt to deal with.
Exactly. Just imagine trying to keep your head above water financially, and then suddenly, you've got less flexibility and a heavier burden. It's a recipe for stress and anxiety.
It's a vicious cycle. And speaking of things that can make your head spin, remember we talked about those gamified investing platforms like Robinhood? Well, it turns out that the decline in net investments on those platforms is particularly pronounced among those low savings households. They're pulling back even more from those types of investments, perhaps feeling the pressure to, redirect funds towards their betting, or simply trying to make up for losses.
Yeah. And it's a little concerning because while those platforms can be, a more accessible way to start investing, they also carry some risks, especially if you're approaching them with that gambling mindset.
Right. It's all about balance and perspective. Investing should be about long-term growth and security,
Yeah.
not about chasing those thrills or trying to get rich quick.
Absolutely. So we've got this potential shift away from investments, an increase in credit card debt, shrinking available credit. Is there any other evidence that these financially constrained households are feeling the pinch?
Unfortunately, yes. The researchers also looked at credit card payments. And guess what? Low savings households, in states where online sports betting was legal, actually reduced the amount they paid towards their credit card bills.
Oh, wow.
And we're not talking about a small bip here. They paid roughly $550 less per quarter.
That's a big deal. That really indicates that these households aren't just shifting funds around. They might be falling behind on their payments, which, leads to higher interest, late fees,
Yeah.
damage to their credit scores.
Right.
It's a slippery slope.
It is. And as if that weren't enough, there's another kind of alarming finding related to overdrafts. So these financially constrained households experienced a higher frequency of overdrafts after online sports betting was introduced,
Right.
which is a pretty clear sign that they're struggling to manage their cash flow and likely resorting to those costly overdraft fees just to cover basic expenses or even fund their betting.
It's really tough to think about the stress and anxiety that this must cause for families who are already struggling.
Absolutely. It really highlights how online sports betting can worsen existing financial problems and push people further into a tough situation.
Yeah.
So we've got all these different pieces of the puzzle, and it seems pretty clear that the potential financial fallout of online sports betting is hitting those who can least afford it the hardest.
It's true. And it's a good reminder that, while sports betting might seem like a harmless pastime, for some, the reality is much more complicated, and the potential consequences can be serious, especially for those who are already vulnerable.
You know, it's tempting for states to just focus on the tax revenue that they get from all this. But we really can't ignore the potential social and economic costs,
Yeah.
especially the impact on those who are already struggling.
As this industry keeps growing, it's more important than ever to be aware of the potential downsides and to advocate for policies and practices that protect those who are most vulnerable.
So to our listeners out there, if you're enjoying those game day thrills, just be mindful of the financial side of things. Set some limits for yourself. Make informed choices. And don't hesitate to seek help if you need it. Remember, it's about enjoying the game without putting your financial well-being at risk.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the world of online sports betting. We hope you found this episode informative and maybe even a little thought-provoking. Thanks for joining us on Coffeesodes.